Hello, I'm going to talk a little bit about flexible budgets. Let me go ahead and pull up the Excel sheet here. Now, what a flexible budget is we've looked at budgets. We've talked about budgets, and a budget is kind of a plan. It kind of starts with the master budget, starts with sales and production, and works its way down to the budgeted financial statements. That's basically known as a static budget. So a static budget would be a budget that's prepared in advance of a period, and it's basically just a company's estimate of what they want to do in the future. So you kind of see a static budget right here. And the static budget basically would be how many units the company expects to sell times the sales price would give us projected sales. And then based on the number of units that be sold, we'd have a rate for direct labor. So 15,000 times 6 gives us 90,000 of direct labor cost. 15,000 times 5 gets us 75,000 of direct materials cost, and 15,000 times 3 per unit gives us 45,000 of variable overhead cost for a contribution margin of 90,000. Now we'd back out our fixed cost and we'd come up with operating income of 40. So the static budget is prepared in advance of the following year, and it's basically what the company expects to do based on the budget. Now, one thing that a company's always going to do is they're always going to compare actual versus the budget. And so let's say that we had actual sales of 16,000. So from a sales perspective, we sold 315,000 where we projected to sell 300,000. So that is a $15,000 favorable variance. Now, when it comes to revenues, the higher the better. So if you did more than what you expected under the budget, that would be a favorable budget variance, kind of like you see here. We actually sold 315, but we anticipated selling 300. So that's a $15,000 favorable variance. Now, for some of our expenses here, think about it this way, though. With expenses, it's just the opposite. With expenses, the lower the better. So if you do less than expected, it's favorable. If you do more than expected, it's unfavorable. So as you see here, that the static budget anticipated 90,000 of direct labor, but the company actually incurred 98. The static budget thought that direct materials would be 75, they were 79. Both of these, you notice, were unfavorable variances because we did more or spent more than was expected. Same thing here for variable overhead. And if you go down to the bottom line, the static budget expected us to have operating income of 40. We only had 36, so that was also unfavorable. Now, one thing to note here, if one thing about budgets is sales is the biggest driver of cost. So one thing to think when you're comparing your static budget with your actual numbers is if your actual sales are greater than the budget, chances are your revenue should be favorable, but a lot of your expenses and costs are going to be unfavorable because if you sell more, you're going to cost, you're going to have more materials, you're going to have more labor, shipping, you're going to have more cost in a lot of different areas because sales is the biggest driver of cost across an organization. So companies will always compare these two, but sometimes it might not be a really good comparison in relation to seeing how well are you managing your cost. Because like I said, if you sell more than what you anticipate, your sales are going to be higher, but a lot of your expenses are going to be higher as well due to that fact. So what a lot of companies do is they will prepare a flexible budget. And what the flexible budget does is it takes the actual amount of sales and it reworks the initial static budget based on what was used to create the initial static budget with the actual sales amount. So for example, here for our flexible budget, we'd take 16,000 times the amount we use for our static budget, and we'd come up with 320,000. And we'd take the 16,000 times 6 for direct labor, to get 96,000, and 16,000 times 5 for direct materials to get 80, and 16,000 times 3 to get 48. Now, of course, our fixed amount stays the same. Remember that fixed costs aren't changed necessarily by changes in activity. They don't, go up as activity goes up. They go down as activity goes down. So then once you've prepared the flexible budget, you compare that with actual, because now actual sales and the sales on the flexible budget are the same. So this should give you a better comparison as to how the company was able to control costs during the period, and look at the results. You see, the flexible budget showed they should have had sales of 320,000, but they only had 315. So they had an unfavorable variance in regards to sales. Remember, with sales, the higher the better. So if you sell more than what's expected, it's a favorable variance. If you sell less than expected, it's an unfavorable variance. Now, look at some of the cost here. Direct labor was 96, but they actually incurred 98. So that's 2,000 unfavorable. Remember, with cost, the lower the better. So in this case, actual results were over the projected flexible cost. And so 2,000 unfavorable. Now, materials, direct materials on the flexible budget showed 80. Actually, they were 79. So that's 1,000 favorable variance. And 52,000 actual variable overhead, 48,000 what was on the flexible budget. So that was 4,000 unfavorable. So the contribution margin was 10,000 unfavorable. And also notice the projected earnings. The flexible budget says they should have made 46. They only made 36. So that was also 10,000 unfavorable. And of course, there was no difference with the fixed cost in this case. So companies always compare. They prepare a static budget, which is what they think they're going to do for the next year before the year begins. They compare it with actual numbers, and then they prepare a flexible budget using the actual sales amount and the criteria used to create the static budget. Then they compare the actual totals with the flexible budget, and they look at were they favorable or unfavorable, and the flexible budget gives them a better estimate of how well the company is managing cost. Thank you, and have a great day.